in the end, history will judge, because there are certain things that were utterly condemned at the time that now seem to be completely justified. If you think about, for the women's movement, for example, there are certain things that women's groups did that were almost universally condemned back in the 60s, 70s. And yet now we think...
Let alone the 1880s or the 1890s with first wave feminism as well.
Now we write books lionising them, and would give them awards.
Or the ANC in South Africa are conducting terrorism in apartheid South Africa. I take that. I mean, I suppose it comes down for me, for what it's worth, as to what the utility will be. Will there be a real utility? I mean, I don't think I'd object if I thought that it was likely to yield fruit. But to the extent that it is likely to alienate people and enable Middle Australia or Middle America to form caricatures about that group, or to regard it as an extremist fringe movement, or to dismiss its concerns because of the behaviour of those people.
Josh, I mean, the way you're a bit younger than I am, so perhaps you don't remember it as kind of direct experience, but the way feminists in the 60s and early 70s were caricatured, and it wasn't, and by the conservative media, which was basically all media at the time, from the perspective now, except probably Tribune, the Communist Party newspaper. But they were, the caricature of the hairy-legged feminist in the overalls, stuck in the Australian community very deeply, and so they persisted, and good on them for it. They weren't intimidated out of their cultural political expression.
No, they shouldn't be intimidated out of their cultural political expression. I guess my bias would be towards, to whatever extent possible, use conversation and argument to make your case. And if a bit of civil disobedience is necessary because you're trying to hold a gay rights march in the 1960s and the police want to bash your head in for it, so you get violent, then that's probably a good way of putting the topic on the table so we can then actually talk about it and use persuasion. It strikes me that the feminists in the 60s were using the minimum amount of civil disobedience necessary to initiate a conversation, and then they won on the power of ideas.
Yeah, but I think that's different there. Initiating conversation and winning on the power of the ideas are two different trends or phenomena. Sometimes climate activists, particularly young climate activists, are criticised because they're alienating the public. They go and sit down the road, block the traffic. How dare you? Violet Cocos, who blocked one lane of the Harbour Bridge for 14 minutes, as a case in point. But often and historically, when you look at this, how protest works, it's not about winning an opinion poll. Sometimes, I'm thinking of the Tent Embassy too, for instance.
Just explain what that was to non-Australian listeners.
Sorry. Okay, so in 1971, a group of young Indigenous activists were actually sitting in a house in Erskineville, an inner city suburb, and they decided that they were sick of the older generation of Indigenous leaders who they thought were too conservative, too implicated with the system, too willing to accept slow progress. And so one of them said, half jokingly, that we don't have a voice in this country. It's if we in our mob live in another nation. And one of them said, well, yeah, we should have our own embassy in Canberra. And so that was the germ. And it was actually, I think, the next day they got in a car, they drove to Canberra, and they borrowed a beach umbrella from a sympathetic activist, and they set up the umbrella in the lawns in the front of Parliament House and held a cardboard sign on which was scrawled Aboriginal Embassy. And within a day or two, they had a tent, and it became the Tent Embassy. And the Tent Embassy attracted more radical Indigenous activists to come and join them. They adopted some of the iconography and behaviour of the Black Panthers in the United States. They terrified middle-class Australia. They alienated the police. Most politicians denounced them vigorously. And some of the older Indigenous leaders had denounced them too. But they seemed to capture a moment. And they started to attract attention. And a lot of students, including me, for example, at the Australian National University, converged on the embassy, the tent, because the police had been instructed to go and tear it down. And it became a defining moment in the Indigenous struggle in Australia. And it was because these 4 young blokes decided, screw this, we're just going to go there and do something. We don't care how much we piss off people, they can all go and get stuffed, So it wasn't about winning public opinion. In fact, they enraged public opinion. And yet it was a vital turning point in the whole.
And so were you there in the early days of the tent embassy?
Yeah.
What was it like?
It was exciting. It was frightening. I remember the police had been instructed to tear down the tent embassy, and
and was it an actual? I don't even think I've ever seen a photo of it. Was it a set of tents?
No,
or
it was just a tent. Just a little tent.
And did it have sides to it, or was it just an umbrella?
No, well, the umbrella had kind of, I don't know what happened to it. It'd be worth a fortune now if someone has it.
It's on eBay. There are probably 17 of them on eBay.
A little kind of tent, just kind of a tent,
like a camping tent.
Like a camping tent, and not very big. But it was enormously symbolic, I mean, it might be a 2-person tent of the old style.
And it's in front of Parliament House?
Old Parliament House.
So, it was just Parliament House at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
What is now Old Parliament House.
Yeah. Australia built a new Parliament House in the interim. But not for that reason. So you would have photos, presumably, of this huge, august Parliament House, which sort of looks like the White House.
Yes.
And then a little ramshackle tent with some Indigenous blokes sitting in it right in front of it.
That's right, with these defiant, angry Indigenous blokes, but also they had a tremendous kind of humour, and humour is very important to protests. And the authorities decided that the Canberra police were too wimpy to do the job, and so they got the kind of riot squad or whatever from Goulburn and Sydney.
Oh, wow. And that's quite unusual because that's a different state. So that normally law enforcement would be held
absolutely
in power by the territory itself. But
by now a couple of thousand
interstate
had gathered around the tent to protect it. And I remember seeing this phalanx of cops lined up at the side of Parliament House. Very scary.
What were they wearing?
They weren't in riot gear, but they had their nightsticks, and they had taken off their numbers so they couldn't be identified for whatever they might do, and they came marching in these ranks around the corner and headed straight for the tent. And there was a first kind of circle of young Indigenous actors who linked arms, and then there was a kind of larger circles of white supporters, basically, a bit further out. And the cops just came storming straight at this kind of 1,000 or so protesters, and just started throwing punches and kicking and carrying on, and they made straight for the tent, and the black activists put up a fight. Some of them, were quite willing, but got beaten up basically, and the cops grabbed the tent and dragged it away, and arrested a few, and then of course the next day a new tent went up, and the whole scene was going to be repeated.